Imagine living in a remote mountain cabin where the mist clings to the ridgelines like the ghosts of forgotten sins. This is the backdrop for one of the darkest secrets ever buried in Appalachian folklore, an unimaginable tale of twisted devotion, family betrayal, and an ideology so warped it defied nature itself. In the early 1900s, Delilah Mae Blackwood was born into a world where love, family, and faith blurred into something unrecognizable. His father wasn't just his father, he was also his jailer, his tormentor, and shockingly, his only form of family. His story, shrouded in silence for generations, was a hidden nightmare until a judge stumbled upon the shocking records that revealed a multi-generational web of abuse, manipulation, and inbreeding. What really happened in the Blackwood family, deep in the Appalachian hollows? And how did this twisted reality survive in isolation for so long? Buckle up as we uncover the unimaginable. Before we dive deeper into this shocking tale, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. Leave a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from, and keep watching for more disturbing tales like this. Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, far from the nearest road, there stood a cabin that no one dared speak of after dark. The Blackwood family had called it home for generations. The cabin's creaky floorboards and smoke curling from the chimney were the only signs of life. It was a place that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 untold secrets, and they were buried deep. The Blackwoods had carved out their lives in a place where the outside world seemed a distant myth. No preacher came to the hollow. No outsider dared venture into the mist-choked mountains. Isolation was their protection, or so they thought. For the Blackwoods, the world beyond the mountains was a place of weakness and impurity, a place where bloodlines were tainted by the influence of outsiders. Ezekiel Blackwood, the patriarch of the family, was a man with twisted beliefs. He convinced his sons that their bloodline was blessed, that it was a divine lineage untouched by the corruption of the world. From an early age, Ezekiel's sons were taught that they were different. They were special. Their family's purity was their greatest strength. Mixing with outsiders was a threat to their very existence, a contamination they could never risk. The Blackwoods had lived this way for decades, hidden from the prying eyes of society. Generations had passed, but their lives were unchanged, trapped in the very same isolation they had sought out to protect themselves. Ezekiel had created a world within the compound, one where nothing existed outside the boundaries of the family. The land they lived on had become their fortress, and the outside world was an enemy they could not trust. As the years passed, the Blackwoods grew more and more obsessed with preserving their bloodline. They had rituals and ceremonies, ways to protect the sacred purity of their line, to ensure that no impurity would ever creep in. These practices began to shape every part of their lives. They began to see the world in terms of purity and impurity, the Blackwoods versus the outsiders. It was no longer just a belief. It was the core of their existence. The family grew, and with each new generation, the circle of isolation grew tighter. Ezekiel's sons were raised to uphold these beliefs, and it was in this environment that the next generation was groomed to continue the legacy of their father. The Blackwood sons were taught from a young age that family loyalty was everything. It was the highest form of devotion, stronger than blood, stronger than anything the world might offer. The family was their world. By the time the sons reached adulthood, they had accepted the doctrine fully. There was no question in their minds that their bloodline was sacred, that their purity was a divine right, and they would do anything to protect it. As they married within the family, they followed Ezekiel's teachings without question. The customs were clear. To preserve the purity of the bloodline, no outside influence could be allowed to corrupt their sacred ties. The marriages were seen as sacred covenants, the next step in preserving the strength of their family line. The idea of mixing blood with outsiders was so taboo that it was unthinkable. They had to remain pure, no matter the cost. The sons, raised on these doctrines, never questioned the path set before them. the rituals, the isolation, the sacredness of their bloodline. It was all they knew. They were bound by duty, even as their world grew darker. What Ezekiel had created was a trap, one that held the Blackwoods in a perpetual state of isolation and devotion. And the younger generation, raised in this environment, would follow the same twisted path set by their father. But even in the deepest corners of the mountain, something began to stir. The cracks in their secluded world were starting to show. The outside world was creeping closer, and with it came the potential for their secrets to be uncovered. No matter how deep they buried their truths, there would come a day when the Blackwood legacy would be exposed. The isolation they had so carefully maintained was beginning to unravel, and with it, their horrific story. Ezekiel Blackwood, the patriarch of the family, was a man whose beliefs were both his strength and his curse. He was obsessed with the idea of maintaining a pure bloodline, believing it was their divine right. His vision began with an unshakable conviction that the Blackwoods were chosen. Their blood, he insisted, was sacred, untouched by the impurities of the outside world. To him, this was their greatest gift. Ezekiel would gather his sons around the hearth on winter nights, speaking of ancient practices of biblical patriarchs who married within their tribes to preserve the purity of their bloodlines. He wove these ideas into their very being. As the sons grew, so did their understanding of Ezekiel's doctrine. They were taught that their bloodline was special, chosen by God to remain untouched by the outside world. This belief became their foundation. To Ezekiel, outsiders were dangerous. They brought with them foreign blood, diluted the purity of the Blackwood line, and would taint their sacred heritage. The world outside was a threat, one that could never be allowed inside. As his sons matured, Ezekiel's teachings became stricter, more intense. He emphasized loyalty to the family above all else. Their brothers were their only true family. Everyone else was to be regarded with distrust. Marriage, in Ezekiel's eyes, was not just about love, it was about preserving the family's purity. He spoke often of the importance of marrying within the family, even pushing his sons to find wives among their own kin. The idea of marrying outsiders was not only forbidden, it was blasphemous. Ezekiel's doctrine spread like wildfire through his sons, each one absorbing his teachings and embracing the belief that their bloodline must remain pure at all costs. Through these teachings, Ezekiel shaped the lives of his sons. They grew up understanding that their loyalty to the family was paramount, even above their own desires or needs. Blood came first, always. In this environment, no one dared question Ezekiel's authority. His word was law, and the family adhered to his doctrine without hesitation. Those who did not were seen as weak, as unworthy of carrying the Blackwood name. The pressure to remain pure, to uphold the sacred bloodline, was ingrained in every action, every decision. For the sons of Ezekiel, the family was everything, and they would do whatever it took to preserve its sanctity. Ezekiel's teachings were deeply rooted in a perverted interpretation of Scripture, twisting stories of biblical families to fit his vision. He drew from Genesis and Leviticus, using fragments of these texts to justify his beliefs. The sons, raised under this doctrine, had no other worldview. To them, their father's teachings were not just beliefs, they were truths. And truths, they believed, had to be protected at all costs. But the more they followed Ezekiel's teachings, the tighter the grip he had on them. They were becoming more isolated, more disconnected from the outside world, and more dependent on the family's twisted view of purity. The family's isolation deepened, and the doctrine of purity began to define every aspect of their lives. Even their relationships were viewed through the lens of preserving the bloodline. Love, it seemed, had little place in this world. The doctrine had transformed the Blackwood men into something more rigid, more obsessed with maintaining their own vision. As they married among their own kin, they reinforced the belief that their bloodline was their divine purpose. This twisted devotion to their doctrine shaped the future of the family. It set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to their downfall. But for now, it kept the Blackwoods bound together in silence. In the darkness of their isolation, the Blackwoods continued to follow Ezekiel's teachings, each son carrying the weight of the family's twisted doctrine. And as they did, they grew further from the world they had once known. As Ezekiel's sons reached adulthood, they embraced their father's vision with an almost religious fervor. They were the new guardians of the Blackwood bloodline, destined to carry on the sacred doctrine of purity. From a young age, they had been taught that their sole purpose in life was to protect their family's purity. As they grew older, this belief became more deeply ingrained, defining their very identities. The sons understood their roles in the family structure. They were to marry within the family, to keep the bloodline as pure as possible. Any deviation from this path was unthinkable. Each brother carried the weight of Ezekiel's doctrine with pride. They believed their very existence was sacred, that they were part of something far greater than themselves. This made them fiercely loyal to one another. Despite the outside world moving closer to their mountain home, the Blackwood brothers remained steadfast in their beliefs. The world outside remained a distant threat, a contamination they could never risk allowing in. The brothers followed in their father's footsteps, preparing for the next generation of Blackwoods to continue the family legacy. They isolated themselves further, convinced that the purity of their bloodline would shield them from any harm. Through the years, the brothers maintained a rigid code of silence. They rarely spoke to anyone outside the compound, choosing instead to focus solely on the preservation of their family's name and beliefs. As time went on, their world became smaller. The outside world was creeping closer, but the Blackwood brothers were focused on their sacred mission, keeping their bloodline pure at all costs. Nothing else mattered. The Blackwoods' sense of self-importance only grew stronger as the years passed. They believed their family was invincible, untouched by the struggles of the world beyond their compound. They were different, chosen, sacred. The brothers were each taught to value loyalty above all else. They believed that their bonds with each other were unbreakable, and that family loyalty was the greatest virtue they could possess. Blood, to them, was everything. In their isolation, the brothers became more insular, more disconnected from the world they had once known. The few outside interactions they had were with each other and their own, reinforcing their sense of superiority. Their devotion to the doctrine of purity and their father's teachings never wavered. They were willing to do whatever it took to protect their family's bloodline, even if that meant sealing themselves off from the outside world. Over time, the brothers' marriages became even more insular, their unions drawing only from the Blackwood line. The idea of mixing blood with outsiders became so repugnant to them that it was viewed as a betrayal. The Blackwoods' lives revolved around a single consuming mission: to preserve their family's purity, to ensure that no impurity could ever taint their sacred bloodline. Everything else took a back seat to this singular focus. As the brothers continued to marry within their own kin, they believed that each union brought them closer to divine favor. They saw themselves as protectors of a legacy, a bloodline that they had been chosen to preserve. With each passing generation, the isolation of the Blackwood brothers grew more pronounced. They believed that their way of life was the only way, and that the outside world was a place of sin, one that must be kept at bay. Ezekiel's teachings had taken root so deeply that the brothers were blind to any other way of life. Their loyalty to one another and to the family was unwavering, and they saw no reason to change their ways. The brothers' commitment to their mission shaped every decision they made, every action they took. They lived and breathed the doctrine of purity, convinced that their lives had a higher purpose, one that only they could fulfill. As they moved further into their isolation, the Blackwood brothers grew more obsessed with their mission. They became increasingly secretive, focusing only on their family and their sacred duty to maintain the purity of their bloodline. In the Blackwood compound, rituals were more than mere traditions. They were sacred practices meant to ensure the survival and purity of the family. These ceremonies were deeply ingrained in every male member's life. Ezekiel Blackwood, the patriarch, led these rituals with unwavering conviction. His belief in the sanctity of the family bloodline drove him to perform ceremonies that he believed were necessary for maintaining divine favor. The rituals took place in the family chapel, a small, dimly lit room where the walls were covered with Ezekiel's handwritten interpretations of Scripture. These were not the teachings of any preacher. They were his own. Every aspect of these ceremonies was designed to reinforce the Blackwood men's sense of superiority. They were told that their family was blessed by God, chosen to preserve a bloodline pure from the outside world's corruption. At the heart of these rituals was the belief that purity could only be preserved through isolation and intense devotion. The Blackwood brothers followed each step of their father's ceremonies with strict obedience, never questioning their meaning. The rituals began with prayer and fasting. Ezekiel would recite passages from the Bible, altered to fit his warped beliefs, as his sons stood in silence. The weight of tradition pressed down on them like a heavy mantle. After the prayer, the Blackwoods would gather around the fire, each son taking a place according to his age and position in the family hierarchy. The youngest stood closest to their father, awaiting his approval. Ezekiel's teachings were reinforced through these repeated ceremonies. Each brother knew his role, understood his place in the family, and embraced the idea that their existence was for the preservation of their bloodline. The rituals also included symbolic acts, anointing with oils, wearing ceremonial robes, and even marking their skin with symbols that Ezekiel believed would protect them from outside influences. These acts were performed with solemn reverence. The brothers never questioned the need for these rituals. From a young age, they had been taught to see them as a necessary part of their lives. The Blackwood bloodline, in their eyes, was sacred and must be guarded. As the rituals progressed, the brothers grew more devoted, more entrenched in their father's belief system. They saw these ceremonies not as mere acts, but as profound declarations of their family's divine destiny. In each ritual, there was a clear message: the family came first. Their bonds with each other were stronger than any bond with the outside world, and the purity of their bloodline was their greatest strength. The rituals culminated in the covenant ceremonies, which were the most sacred of all. These took place under the cover of night, away from the eyes of outsiders. Only the Blackwood men were allowed to participate. The covenant ceremonies were deeply personal to the brothers. They were told that by partaking in these rites, they were cementing their place in the family's divine mission. They were not just sons, they were protectors of the bloodline. Each son knew that the covenant was a sacred duty, one that required absolute loyalty to the family, even if that loyalty meant sacrifice. The idea of breaking the covenant was unimaginable. It was a betrayal of the highest order. As the brothers grew older, the rituals became more intense. They were told that their sacrifices were necessary to preserve the purity of the Blackwood bloodline. Each brother understood that his life was not his own. The covenant ceremonies took on an almost mystical quality. They were wrapped in the language of fate and destiny, and each son believed that his place in the family was part of a greater divine plan. The rituals also served as a form of control. By tying the brothers to these ceremonies, Ezekiel ensured that they would remain loyal to the family and to him. The fear of betrayal was deeply ingrained in their minds. Through these rituals, the Blackwood men were bound together by more than blood. They were united by a belief system so ingrained that it became the very foundation of their existence. It was a belief that could not be shaken. Ezekiel's control over his sons grew stronger with each ritual. The Blackwoods were not just a family, they were a cult, bound together by a shared vision of purity and devotion. Their lives were dedicated to this singular purpose. The price of maintaining the purity of the Blackwood bloodline became painfully apparent as the generations progressed. Ezekiel's twisted beliefs had consequences, and the family's obsession with purity led to devastating results. As the years passed, more children were born within the compound. Ezekiel's doctrine, deeply ingrained in every male member, pushed them to marry only within the family, ensuring the bloodline remained pure. But nature, as it always does, fought back. The first signs of the family's genetic troubles were subtle. Children born into the Blackwood compound began to show unusual traits, physical deformities that were impossible to ignore. The family, however, believed these were signs of divine favor. The brothers, raised on their father's teachings, interpreted these deformities as a mark of the family's purity, proof that their bloodline had been set apart by God. But the truth was far darker. As the deformities grew more pronounced, some of the younger Blackwood sons began to question what they were seeing. The birth of children with twisted limbs, crooked faces, and strange eyes unsettled them, but they dared not voice their concerns. Ezekiel saw these deformities as divine signs. To him, the more severe the deformities, the stronger the proof that their bloodline was untainted, untouched by the corrupting influence of the outside world. It was, in his eyes, proof of their holiness. The other brothers, too deeply entrenched in their father's doctrine, followed suit. They celebrated the births of these children, believing they were being blessed with divine favor, even as the rest of the world would have seen them as tragic. The compound became a place of strange births and even stranger beliefs. The Blackwood brothers never questioned the cause of their children's deformities. They believed that suffering was a test of their faith, and they endured it without protest. For the Blackwood men, the deformities were proof of something sacred. They were told that these children were part of God's plan, a plan that could not be understood by outsiders. They were chosen to bear this burden. But the toll of inbreeding began to show in other ways. The children grew weaker, less able to fend for themselves. Some were born mute, others blind or crippled. It was clear that their health was suffering, but the family believed it was a necessary sacrifice. Despite the obvious suffering of the children, Ezekiel insisted that their conditions were a sign of spiritual strength. He would hold each child up, declaring them to be blessed, angels sent by God to ensure the purity of the Blackwood line. The younger sons, seeing the deformities worsening, began to feel the weight of their father's teachings more than ever. They understood the cost of maintaining the bloodline's purity, and it was a cost that weighed heavily on their hearts. By the time the next generation of Blackwood men was born, the deformities had become more severe. Some children could barely walk, while others had physical deformities that made them appear more like grotesque caricatures than human beings. The family, however, continued to see these children as proof of God's favor. The more severe the deformities, the more convinced they became that their bloodline was sacred. To them, the price of purity was worth paying. As the years wore on, the compound became a place of sorrow. The once proud Blackwood family, filled with sons and brothers devoted to their sacred mission, was now a family haunted by the toll of their beliefs. But no one dared speak out. No one questioned Ezekiel's doctrine for fear of the wrath it might bring. To break from the tradition would be to dishonor the family, to reject the very purpose for which they had lived. And so the Blackwood family continued, isolated from the world, their beliefs growing ever more twisted with each passing generation. The price of purity, they believed, was a small price to pay for the preservation of their sacred bloodline. The brothers, bound together by the same twisted vision, lived in a world of their own making. A world where the cost of maintaining purity was measured in the suffering of their own flesh and blood. As the Blackwood family's isolation continued, the toll of inbreeding began to unravel the family's resolve. The brothers, once so devoted to their father's teachings, could no longer ignore the cracks in their foundation. The younger generations, born into this world of genetic decay, began to question what they had been taught. They saw their brothers and children suffer, and though the old teachings still held power, doubts began to creep in. The deformities, once celebrated as divine signs, were now impossible to ignore. The younger Blackwood men could no longer dismiss the suffering around them as proof of holiness. The cost of purity had become too high. Ezekiel, growing older, refused to see the truth. His grip on his sons remained firm, and he insisted that their suffering was part of a greater plan, that the family was being tested. But the doubts continued to grow. There were whispered conversations among the younger brothers, though they spoke in hushed tones, fearful of angering Ezekiel. They knew that challenging their father's teachings could lead to punishment, even exile. But their discomfort was becoming unbearable. The compound, once a fortress of isolation, began to feel like a prison. The brothers could no longer ignore the obvious suffering around them. Their children, born with twisted bodies and minds, were reminders of the price they had paid for purity. Some of the younger Blackwood men began to distance themselves from the teachings they had grown up with. They didn't openly rebel, but in the quiet moments, they questioned their father's vision. Was this truly God's will? As the years passed, the sense of duty to the Blackwood bloodline became a heavy burden. The younger brothers were beginning to see that their lives were being sacrificed for a cause that seemed increasingly misguided. The family's isolation, once a source of strength, now felt like a curse. The outside world, which they had always viewed with distrust, seemed less threatening than the suffocating atmosphere within the compound. It was a place of unspoken tension. The brothers, once united by a single purpose, began to fracture. Some held steadfast to their father's beliefs, unwilling to abandon the legacy they had inherited. Others, however, could no longer ignore the painful reality that surrounded them. The turning point came when one of the younger Blackwood sons, deeply affected by the deformities in his own children, finally spoke out. He confronted Ezekiel, demanding answers for the suffering they had endured. It was a moment of rebellion. Ezekiel's response was swift and brutal. He condemned his son for doubting the family's mission, calling him weak and unworthy. The others watched in silence, afraid to speak up, but each brother felt the weight of the moment. For the first time, the Blackwood brothers began to see the cracks in their father's authority. They realized that their blind devotion to the doctrine had led them to a path of destruction. But there was no turning back. The fear of Ezekiel's wrath kept the brothers in line, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. The younger generation knew they could no longer ignore the reality of their situation. The cost of purity had become too great to bear. Some of the brothers began to quietly plan an escape, thinking of ways to leave the compound without angering their father. They knew that breaking from Ezekiel's teachings was dangerous, but they could not live with the consequences any longer. The Blackwood compound, once a place of unity, had become a house divided. The brothers were no longer sure of the path they had chosen, and the weight of their shared history threatened to tear them apart. In the silence of the compound, the brothers wrestled with their own conscience. They knew they had been part of something monstrous, but they also knew that breaking free would come with its own cost, one they might not be able to bear. The breaking point had arrived. The Blackwood brothers could no longer ignore the truth of their situation. Their lives, their children's lives, had been sacrificed for a doctrine that was not divine, but destructive. The Blackwood compound had long been hidden from the outside world, but as modern roads slowly snaked their way into the mountains, the family's isolation was beginning to erode. The outside world was creeping closer. The brothers, still bound by their father's teachings, remained oblivious to the encroaching changes. They continued their lives in silence, hidden away from the prying eyes of outsiders, believing their way of life would never be discovered. But change was inevitable. In 1917, a forest ranger named Thomas Mitchell ventured deeper into the Kentucky wilderness than most had dared. He was tracking a wounded deer when he first noticed the smoke rising from the Blackwood compound. Intrigued, Mitchell followed the thin trail of smoke through the dense trees. The further he ventured, the more he began to wonder about the source. His curiosity led him directly to the Blackwood compound, a place he had only heard of in local whispers. Mitchell, accustomed to the isolation of the mountains, was initially shocked by what he saw. The cabins, weathered by time, seemed out of place among the lush wilderness. But it was the people who caught his attention. As Mitchell approached, he noticed the strange figures moving about. The children, some of whom were clearly deformed, wandered the grounds like ghosts, unable to speak or care for themselves. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies weak. The adults, too, moved in a peculiar manner, shuffling through the compound with an unnatural gait. Their faces seemed hollow, as though the weight of years of isolation and suffering had taken its toll on them. At the center of the compound, Mitchell spotted Ezekiel Blackwood, now an older man, still holding court as the patriarch of the family. He stood tall, his presence imposing even in his weakened state. Mitchell was struck by the aura of authority he still commanded. But it was the sight of Delilah May, the young woman who had grown up under Ezekiel's influence, that truly disturbed Mitchell. Now in her late 20s, she looked decades older, her eyes vacant as she wandered among her children. Mitchell, disturbed by what he saw, made a mental note of the location before turning back toward the forest. He had witnessed something deeply troubling, but he couldn't quite place what it was. His instincts told him something was wrong. Back in the town, Mitchell quietly shared his discovery with a few trusted individuals. Word spread slowly, but soon enough, authorities were alerted to the strange happenings deep in the mountains. A plan was put in motion to investigate. In the months that followed, an investigation was launched. The authorities struggled to untangle the complex web of relationships within the Blackwood compound. The family had been living in such isolation that their connections were difficult to trace. Despite the confusion, the investigation eventually revealed the truth. The Blackwood family had been engaging in practices of extreme inbreeding for generations, all in the name of purity. The legacy of Ezekiel's teachings had led them down a dark path. Authorities were horrified by what they uncovered. The Blackwood men had married within their own bloodline for decades, producing children who were physically and mentally impaired. Yet, the family had continued to believe their actions were divinely justified. The investigation dragged on for years, as authorities worked to separate the truth from the twisted family narrative. The Blackwoods, who had lived in complete isolation for so long, were now thrust into the harsh light of the outside world. The full extent of the family's abuse came to light slowly. The court records revealed the dark truth about Ezekiel's role in perpetuating the abuse and the psychological manipulation he had inflicted upon his sons for generations. When the truth was finally revealed, it sent shockwaves through the community. The Blackwoods, once seen as a mysterious and isolated family, were now exposed for what they truly were: a family ensnared in a web of lies, isolation, and horrific abuse. Ezekiel Blackwood, now a frail old man, was arrested and taken into custody. His sons, many of whom had become broken shells of men, were also taken into custody. They had lived under their father's influence for so long that they knew no other way of life. The authorities worked to remove the surviving members of the Blackwood family from the compound, placing them in state care. It was clear that the damage done to their bodies and minds would be impossible to undo completely. But the investigation was far from over. The psychological scars left by decades of manipulation and abuse ran deep. The Blackwood family's legacy would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved and the community at large. The Blackwood compound, once a symbol of isolation and secrecy, was burned to the ground by court order. The land was cleared, and the final remnants of their twisted legacy were erased from the mountains. But the memories lingered. The discovery of the Blackwood family's twisted legacy marked the end of an era. The compound, once a fortress of isolation and secrecy, was now a symbol of horror, a dark chapter in Appalachian history. As the Blackwood men were taken into custody, they were confronted with the reality of what their lives had become. They had lived for generations under the oppressive grip of Ezekiel's teachings, and now they were forced to face the consequences. The community, once too afraid to speak about the Blackwoods, was shaken to its core. The truth about the family's isolation, inbreeding, and abuse was now exposed, and no one could ignore the horror any longer. Ezekiel Blackwood, now an old man, was placed under arrest. His frail body, once the symbol of patriarchal authority, was now shackled and broken. His long reign of control over his sons had come to an end. The sons, many of whom had never known any life outside the Blackwood compound, were left to grapple with the truth. They had been raised to believe that their bloodline was sacred, that their actions were divinely justified. But now, in the light of the outside world, they could no longer deny the damage they had caused, the deformities, the suffering, the psychological scars. They could not escape the reality of their actions, no matter how deeply they had believed in their father's doctrine. Some of the brothers tried to justify their actions, clinging to the teachings that had defined their lives, but others, the younger generation, began to question everything they had been taught. The years of manipulation had left them broken, lost. The investigation into the Blackwood family's practices continued for years. The courts and authorities struggled to unravel the full extent of the damage, but the truth had already been revealed. The Blackwood legacy could not be erased so easily. The surviving Blackwood brothers were placed into state care, though the damage to their minds and bodies was irreversible. The years of isolation, abuse, and inbreeding had left them incapable of leading normal lives. They were broken by their own history. The children of the Blackwood men, many of whom had been born with severe deformities, were also taken into care. Some of them survived, though their quality of life would forever be altered by the trauma they had endured. The Blackwood compound was destroyed and the land was cleared. The once proud home of the Blackwood family, a place of twisted devotion and perverse loyalty, was reduced to ashes. It was the final end to a dark chapter. The surrounding community, though horrified by what had happened, began to heal. The secret of the Blackwoods had been buried for so long that no one truly knew the full extent of the family's suffering until it was too late. But even as the community began to rebuild, the legacy of the Blackwoods lingered in the air. The mountain hollow, once home to generations of the family, now stood empty. The echoes of their twisted history seemed to haunt the land. Ezekiel Blackwood's death, though quiet and unnoticed, marked the true end of the family's reign. His twisted beliefs had died with him, but the scars he left on his sons and grandsons would last for generations. As the years passed, the Blackwood name faded from memory. The family's story became a cautionary tale, a dark legend that was whispered about but rarely discussed. Their twisted devotion to purity had led them down a path of destruction. The land where the Blackwood compound once stood remained silent, a reminder of the terrible price of isolation and blind loyalty. The community moved on, but the memory of what had happened would never be forgotten. In the end, the Blackwood legacy had been one of broken lives, shattered beliefs, and a history too dark to fully comprehend. The last of the Blackwoods, now lost in the state care system, would never know peace. The truth had finally come to light, but the damage had already been done. The Blackwood family, once so proud of their purity, had been destroyed by their own actions, and the world would never forget the story of their downfall.